A woman rolls off a train in a wheelchair, and an entire frontier town goes silent. The man waiting for her doesn't say a word. The crowd whispers, but she lifts her chin, looks every single one of them in the eye, and doesn't apologize for a thing. What happens next will change one family, one ranch, and one hard Montana town forever. This is the story of a woman the world underestimated, and the price that world paid for getting her wrong. If you love stories about real courage, earned love, and the kind of strength that doesn't ask for anyone's permission, subscribe to our channel so you never miss what's coming next. Hit like, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The train was 20 minutes late, which gave the people of Silvergate plenty of time to gather. They came the way people in small towns always did, unhurried, with the particular casualness of those who had nothing better to do and knew it. The women brought their shopping baskets and their opinions. The men leaned against fence posts and telegraph poles with their arms crossed. The children wove between adult legs and stared openly at the platform because children had not yet learned to pretend they weren't curious. Caleb Boon stood apart from all of them. He was at the far end of the platform, near the water tower, with his hat pulled low and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he had already decided something and didn't intend to discuss it. He was 41 years old and looked it. Not in a broken way, but in the way of a man who had spent 2 decades working land that pushed back. His hands were rough. There was a scar along his left jawline from a fence wire accident 7 years ago. His coat was clean but not new, and he wore it the same way he wore everything, like it was meant to do a job, and he expected it to do one. He was not a man who enjoyed being stared at. He was also not a man who had expected to be standing on a train platform in October waiting for a woman he'd never met. That had not been part of any plan he'd made for his life. But life had a way of dismantling plans, and Caleb Boon had learned, at considerable cost, that you either adapted or you drowned. Clara had been gone for 4 years. He didn't let himself think her name often. It had the quality of a bruise, bearable most of the time, but if you pressed on it wrong, the pain was still sharp enough to make you catch your breath. She had died in the spring of 1875, when the twins were 3 years old, and Caleb had spent the 4 years since then doing what he always did, working, managing, getting through. The ranch didn't mourn. The cattle didn't care. The seasons kept turning whether he was ready for them or not. But the children were 7 now, and 7 was different from 3. Sarah asked questions that Caleb didn't know how to answer. Not complicated questions, just the kind that came from a child who was watching the world and noticing what was missing. Why don't we have curtains like the Hendersons? Can you braid hair, Papa? What did Mama smell like? He would stand there in his kitchen at the end of a long day with dirt still on his boots, and his daughter would look up at him with those steady brown eyes, and he would feel the particular helplessness of a man who could break a horse and fix a fence line and read weather by the color of the sky, but could not answer a 7-year-old girl's questions about curtains. Samuel was worse, in a different way. Samuel had gone quiet. He'd been a noisy child once, Caleb could remember that, just barely. But somewhere in the last year or two, he had retreated into himself in a way that made the house feel like it had an extra empty room. He did his chores without being asked and without complaint, which would have been ideal in a ranch hand and was quietly devastating in a child. Caleb had tried talking to him. The conversations went nowhere. Samuel would listen politely and answer in short sentences and then go back to whatever he'd been doing, and Caleb would be left standing there feeling like he'd tried to open a door that didn't have a handle. He was not equipped for this. He knew it. He'd known it for a while. The advertisement had been placed in March. He'd written it himself, which had taken 3 evenings and 2 wasted sheets of paper, and he had felt ridiculous the entire time. Rancher, widower, 2 children, seeks capable woman for partnership and household management. He had stared at that last part for a long time before leaving it in. He hadn't written seeks wife because he wasn't sure that was what he was seeking. He wasn't sure what he was seeking. He just knew that something needed to change. The response from Philadelphia had come in May. Her name was Evelyn Dorset. She wrote clearly and directly, without the kind of decorative language that made him suspicious. She was 28. She had managed her father's household for 6 years after her mother's death. She had some schooling. She liked children. She was practical. She wanted a fresh start somewhere far from where she'd been. She did not explain what she was running from, but Caleb hadn't asked. He had things he didn't explain either. They had exchanged 4 letters. Then he had sent the train ticket. She had not told him about the wheelchair. He found out the way everyone else found out. When the train pulled into Silvergate Station and the porter appeared in the doorway of the second passenger car and began the process of maneuvering a folding chair down onto the platform. Then the woman. She was small. That was the first thing he registered, and it surprised him because her letters hadn't felt small. They'd felt like they came from someone who took up space in a room. She had dark hair pinned back, a blue traveling coat that had seen better years, and she was watching the porter with a particular focused expression, giving him quiet instructions that Caleb couldn't hear from where he was standing. When the chair was positioned and locked, she moved into it with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped thinking about it. Then she looked up. She found him almost immediately. He didn't know how. The platform was crowded enough, but her eyes went straight to his face, and she held his gaze with an evenness that he would think about later. She did not smile. She did not look away. She simply looked at him the way you look at a person when you are trying to figure out exactly what you're dealing with. Around them, the platform had gone quiet. Not silent. There was still the noise of the train, the porter moving luggage, a child somewhere crying at the far end. But the particular murmur of a gathered crowd had stopped. Caleb could feel it without looking. He could feel the Hendersons 2 spots to his left and Doc Marsh near the ticket window, and the Pruitt sisters who could generate an opinion about anything within 30 seconds of observing it. He walked toward her. It was about 20 feet, and those 20 feet felt longer than they had any right to. He kept his face arranged the way he kept it when he was doing something he didn't want to do and intended to do anyway. "Miss Dorset," he said. "Mr. Boon." Her voice was steady, not performatively steady, not the kind of steady that's working to be steady, just straightforward and clear. She had a small case in her lap and a larger trunk that the porter was lowering from the baggage car. "I expect you have some things you'd like to say." "I do," he said. "I thought you might." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the chair, then back at her face. "You didn't mention this in your letters." "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why not?" She met his gaze without blinking. "Because you wouldn't have sent the ticket." That was probably true, and he didn't say it wasn't, because he'd made it a rule a long time ago not to lie about things that didn't need lying about. He stood there with the October wind moving across the platform and the whole town of Silvergate watching, and he tried to think about what came next. "I can work," she said, "if that's your concern. I can manage accounts and correspondence and a kitchen. I can teach children. I have references from 2 households in Philadelphia, both of which I can provide in writing. I am not asking you to carry me. I am asking you to give me the same consideration you'd give anyone else who stepped off that train." "I hired a woman to run a ranch," he said. "Montana's not—" "I know what Montana is," she said. "I read. I also spoke with 2 women who made the same journey, one of whom has been homesteading in the territory for 9 years. She paused. "I'm not uninformed, Mr. Boon. I prepared for this." Behind him, he could hear the Pruitt sisters beginning to murmur again. Someone else said something he couldn't make out. A few feet away, a man whose name he could not currently remember was watching with the open avidity of someone at a county fair. Caleb turned around. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the crowd with the particular expression that had, over 20 years, communicated to ranch hands and difficult cattle and various other parties that the conversation was not for them and they should find somewhere else to be. It worked on the crowd the same way it worked on everything else. The murmuring stopped. People found suddenly urgent reasons to look elsewhere. He turned back to Evelyn Dorset. "The ranch is 4 miles out," he said. "The road is rough. I've got a wagon." She nodded once, like he'd confirmed something she already knew. "That's fine." He picked up her trunk. It was heavier than he expected, and he adjusted his grip without comment. He carried it to the wagon, came back and looked at the chair and then at the wagon bed, doing the practical arithmetic. "There's a step," he said. "I know." She was already beside the wagon, examining it. She had moved across the platform quickly. The boards were rough in places, with gaps, and she had navigated them without apparent difficulty. If you can hold the chair steady while I transfer, I can manage the rest. He wasn't sure he believed that, but he held the chair steady. She was stronger than she looked. That was the second thing he registered. She moved herself from the chair to the wagon seat with the kind of upper body strength that came from years of it, and she did it without asking for help and without performing the effort of it for anyone watching. When she was settled, she folded the chair herself. It collapsed with a practiced click, and handed it to him to stow in the wagon bed. He walked around to his side, got up, picked up the reins. Neither of them said anything for a while. The town fell behind them. The road opened up into the flat, wide grass of the valley, and the mountains sat on the horizon doing what Montana mountains always did, which was exist with a kind of size that made everything else feel provisional. "Your children," she said. "How old?" 7. Twins, Sarah and Samuel. "Do they know I'm coming?" "They know I sent for someone. I didn't tell them much else." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the grass moving in the wind. "What are they like?" He thought about how to answer that. Sarah talks a lot. She's curious. She gets attached to things and people faster than is probably good for her. He paused. Samuel doesn't talk much. He used to. He's been different the last couple of years. Since their mother died. Yes. How did she die? The question was direct enough that it caught him slightly off guard. Most people didn't ask. They'd offer their condolences in that particular careful way that meant they wanted to acknowledge it but didn't want to get near it. "Fever," he said. It moved fast. She was sick 4 days. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. It was simple, without decoration. She didn't follow it with anything else, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. They rode in silence for a while. A hawk was working the air above the eastern field, circling in long, slow arcs. The wagon wheels found every rut in the road, which was all of them. "You should know," Evelyn said eventually, "that I understand this isn't what you planned for." "No," he agreed, "it isn't. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'd appreciate if you didn't either." She was looking straight ahead. "I can be useful to you and your children. I believe that genuinely, but I understand if you need time to decide if that's true. And I would rather you tell me plainly where I stand than pretend everything is fine when it isn't." He looked at her sideways. "You always this direct?" "It saved me a lot of trouble over the years." He almost said something to that. Instead, he just nodded at the road ahead. "The ranch comes up around that bend. House needs work. I know it. It's on the list." "Most things worth having usually need work," she said. It wasn't a reassurance exactly. It was more like an observation made by someone who'd had enough time to think about it. The house came into view. It was 2 stories, timber frame with a porch that sagged on the left side, and windows that needed caulking around the frames before winter. The barn was in better shape than the house because the barn was where work happened, and the house was where Caleb Boon simply tried to get through the evenings. There was a garden space along the south side that had gone to weeds, a fence along the near pasture that was doing its job. Mostly. An oak tree at the corner of the yard that was the one beautiful thing about the property that had gotten that way without any help from him. 2 children were standing on the porch. Sarah had both hands gripping the railing and was leaning forward as far as she could without falling over it, straining to see who was in the wagon. Samuel stood a foot behind her with his arms at his sides, watching. Even from a distance, Caleb could read the difference in them. Sarah all open forward energy. Samuel closed back and cautious. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch steps. Sarah's eyes went immediately to the chair in the wagon bed. She was 7, not a baby. She knew what it was. Her expression moved through several things in about 2 seconds and then settled on something that was mostly just curious. "Papa," she said carefully, "she has a—" "Sarah." His voice was even. "Come say hello." Sarah came down the steps. Samuel stayed where he was. Evelyn was already preparing to get down from the wagon, moving with the same practiced efficiency she'd used at the station. Caleb went around to her side without asking and helped with the chair without making it into anything, and she transferred herself into it on the flat ground in front of the porch and looked up at Sarah with the first real expression he'd seen from her. Not a performance of warmth, just something quieter than that. Interest. "You must be Sarah," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah was staring at the chair. Then, with the particular directness of children who haven't learned yet that some questions aren't asked, "Why are you in that?" "My legs don't work the way yours do," Evelyn said, matter of fact, without apology. "They haven't since I was 12. Sarah thought about this. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore." "Can you walk at all?" "Sarah." Caleb's voice carried a warning note. "It's all right," Evelyn said, and she meant it. He could tell the difference between someone being polite about a thing and someone who genuinely didn't mind. She looked back at Sarah. "A little, with help. Mostly I get around in the chair." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this. "I can help push sometimes," she offered, "if you need. I might take you up on that." Caleb looked up at the porch. Samuel was still there, still back against the wall with his arms at his sides. Their eyes met. Samuel looked away first, back at Evelyn, with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not welcoming either, just watchful. "Samuel," Caleb said, "come down and meet Miss Dorset." There was a pause, not defiance. Samuel wasn't defiant. He just moved through the world at his own speed. He came down the steps carefully and stood at the bottom of them and looked at Evelyn with that same careful, watchful expression. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Samuel." She didn't try too hard with him. Caleb noticed that. She didn't lean forward or put on extra brightness the way some adults did with quiet children, like volume could substitute for connection. She just looked at him directly and let the hello be enough. Samuel looked at the chair again, then at her face, then back at the chair with the slightly puzzled expression of someone working through a practical problem. "How do you get it up the porch steps?" he asked. It was the most words he'd said to a stranger in months. "That," Evelyn said, "is an excellent question. I was just about to figure that out." Caleb brought the trunk inside first. There were 3 steps up to the porch, which was 3 more than she could manage without help. He came back out and looked at the problem and at her, waiting. "If you can tilt the chair back slightly while I hold the wheels," she said, "I can direct the angle. We've done it before." "We've done it," he repeated. "With other stairs, other people." She caught his expression. "I'm not fragile, Mr. Boon. You won't break me." He tilted the chair back. She directed the angle. They got up the steps in 2 movements, awkward but functional, and then they were on the porch and she was settled again. And Caleb was standing there with the particular sensation of having done something he didn't have a clear category for. The inside of the house was what it was. He'd cleaned it that morning, swept, cleared the table, done the dishes that had accumulated for 3 days. It was tidier than usual, which wasn't saying a great deal. There were curtains on the front windows that Clara had made, which had faded to a color that was somewhere between yellow and what yellow used to be. The kitchen had a good stove. The table was solid, handmade, the one thing in the house he had built himself and was genuinely proud of. Evelyn moved through it slowly, not commenting, just looking. She noted the door widths, the layout of the kitchen, the way the main room connected to the 2 side rooms. He watched her do it and understood that she was assessing the place the way he would assess a piece of land, practically for what it offered and what it would take. "The room on the left," he said. "That'll be yours. It's not large." She looked in. It had a bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the side yard toward the barn. It was probably 9 by 10 feet. "It's fine," she said. "The door's narrow. The chair might be—" "May I?" She moved toward it. The chair fit through with about 2 inches on each side. She turned around inside without difficulty. "It's fine," she said again, and he understood that she'd had worse and wasn't going to make a point of it. He showed her the kitchen. The pump was inside, which he told her because he knew from the letters that she'd asked specifically. The well water was good, cold in summer, didn't freeze in winter because the pipe ran deep. The stove burned wood, and there was a cord stacked on the back porch. The root cellar was accessible from the kitchen through a floor door, which was going to be a problem, but he had a shelf system in the kitchen for the things she'd need most regularly and could bring up anything heavier himself. She listened to all of it without interrupting. "Questions?" he said. She had about a dozen, and they were all practical. where the supplies were stored, what the children's schedule was, whether there was any system currently for the household accounts, or if it was all in his head. He answered them honestly, including the part where the accounts were mostly in his head and there wasn't really a system. "I can fix that," she said. "Give me a week." Sarah, who had been following them through the house with the unself-conscious trailing of a child who has decided she's interested in something, tugged on Evelyn's sleeve. "Can you cook?" "I can," Evelyn said. "What's your favorite thing to eat?" "Biscuits with jam," Sarah said immediately. "Papa's biscuits are—" She glanced at Caleb with the diplomatic expression of someone who has opinions they are choosing to soften. "He tries." "She means they're bad," Samuel said from the doorway. He wasn't quite smiling, but there was something at the corner of his mouth. Caleb looked at him. "They're edible." "Barely," Samuel said. And then, as if surprising himself, he looked at Evelyn. "He burns the bottoms." Evelyn looked at Caleb with an expression that was entirely neutral. "I see." "The stove runs hot," Caleb said. It was a perfectly accurate thing to say, and it was also not the reason the biscuits were bad, and everyone in the kitchen understood this. Evelyn made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, controlled before it arrived. She looked back at Sarah. "I'll make biscuits tomorrow morning. We'll see how they turn out." Sarah immediately looked satisfied, as though this was a conclusion she had arranged and was pleased with. They ate dinner that first evening from what Caleb had put together: cold chicken, bread, last week's preserves. Evelyn sat at the table and ate without comment and asked the children questions that were not the questions most adults asked. Not what do you like in school or are you being good, but what's the best thing you've seen this week? And Sarah said a red fox near the creek with the animated detail of a child who has been waiting to tell someone. And Samuel, after a pause, said a hawk that had been circling the east field for 3 days like it was counting something. And Evelyn asked him what he thought it was counting, and he thought about it for a moment and said he didn't know, but it felt like it knew something they didn't, and Evelyn nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. Caleb watched this over his bread and didn't say anything. After dinner, the children went to their room and Caleb sat at the table with the accounts ledger he'd told himself he'd get to for 2 weeks and had not gotten to. Evelyn remained at the table. She had taken a small notebook from her case and was writing something. A list, he thought. "You should know," he said without looking up from the ledger, "that this is not settled." She didn't look up either. "I know. I agreed to see how it works. A month? That's fair. But if it doesn't, I'll go," she said. "I'm not asking you to make a promise you don't mean." She kept writing. "I'm asking for the same thing I've always had to ask for, a chance to show what's actually true." He looked at her then. She was still looking at her notebook, pen moving in small, careful letters. The lamp on the table cast the kind of light that made everything look slightly warmer than it was. "What is actually true?" he asked. She looked up. "That I can do this." She said it simply, without drama. The way you say something you've had to say so many times it doesn't need ornamentation anymore. "I know you don't believe that yet. I'm not asking you to. I'm just telling you what's true." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the ledger. Outside, the Montana wind came down from the north and moved through the grass in the dark, and the house made the sounds old houses make when the temperature drops, and somewhere in the east field a coyote called and was not answered. Caleb Boon sat at his table and tried to think about numbers and thought instead about the woman at the other end of it, writing her careful list, and the fact that his son had said more words at dinner than he'd said in a week, and the fact that for the first time in a long time, the house had felt for just a few minutes like something other than 4 walls around a gap. He didn't let himself make too much of it, but he noticed it. That was the first night. There would be 30 of them before anything was decided, and most of them would be harder than this one, and some of them would be harder than anything that had come before. But that was the first night, and Caleb Boon, who was not a man who made room for things he hadn't planned for, made room for the fact that tomorrow Evelyn Dorset was going to make biscuits, and he was genuinely curious whether they'd be better than his. They were. He didn't say so out loud, but when Sarah looked at him over her plate with that particular expression, he caught her eye and looked away, and Sarah, who was 7 and had inherited her mother's ability to read a room, smiled at her plate and didn't press the point. The biscuits were better than his. That was just a fact, and facts didn't care whether you were comfortable with them. Caleb had eaten 3 of them on that first morning without comment, and Sarah had eaten 2.5 and spent the rest of breakfast talking about them with the focused enthusiasm of someone reviewing something they intended to think about for a long time. Samuel had eaten his quietly, and then, when he thought no one was watching, taken a 4th one from the plate in the center of the table and put it in his shirt pocket for later. Evelyn had seen him do it and said nothing. Caleb had seen her see him and say nothing, and something about that small exchange, its smallness, its lack of drama, had stayed with him through the morning while he was out fixing the section of fence along the north pasture that had been on his list for 2 weeks. The trial period was his idea, and he stood behind it. 1 month. He told himself it was practical. Give the arrangement time to prove itself one way or another before anyone made promises they couldn't keep. But the truth, which he was not quite ready to examine directly, was that the trial period also gave him somewhere to put his doubt. It was a shelf. He could set the doubt on it and not have to deal with it every hour of every day. The first week was difficult in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't Evelyn. She did what she'd said she would do. She worked. She took over the kitchen with a quiet competence that made his own efforts look like what they were, a man doing the minimum necessary to keep 2 children fed. By the 3rd day, the stove was being used in ways he hadn't known a stove could be used, and there were actual meals with components that related to each other, and the preserves were organized on the shelf in the kitchen instead of wherever they'd been put and forgotten. She also started on the accounts, which he'd warned her was not going to be a pleasant experience, and she had looked at the ledger for about 20 minutes on the second evening and then looked at him with an expression that was carefully neutral and said, "When did you last total these?" "March, I think." "Of this year?" He said nothing, which was answer enough. She spent 3 evenings on the ledger working after the children were in bed, asking him questions when she needed information he had in his head rather than on paper. He answered them directly, and she wrote things down in that small, careful hand, and by the end of the week there was an actual accounting of the ranch's financial position that he could read and understand, and that was, he had to admit, considerably cleaner than the system, if it could be called that, he'd been running for the past 4 years. "You're not in as bad a position as the ledger made it look," she told him on the 5th evening, sliding it across the table. "But the winter supply order needs to happen soon or the prices go up, and there are 3 accounts receivable from last season that haven't been collected." "Harlan Pruitt," he said. "Possibly, I don't have names, just amounts. Harlan Pruitt, Deke Morrison, and the Calloway brothers." He said it without particular feeling. "They'll pay eventually." "Will they?" "No," he admitted. "Not Morrison. He's been running behind since '77, and I've been letting it go because his wife was ill." He paused. "She's better now." "Then someone needs to collect." He looked at her. She was not being unkind about it. She was just stating the arithmetic. He'd been letting debt slide because he'd found it easier to avoid the conversations, and the result was sitting in front of him in a ledger that had 3 gaps in it like missing teeth. "I'll go next week," he said. "Good." The difficult thing that first week was not the work. It was the children. Or rather, it was watching Evelyn with the children and not knowing what to do with what he was seeing. Sarah had attached herself to Evelyn with the speed and completeness of a child who had been waiting for exactly this kind of attachment without knowing what shape it would take. She followed her through the morning work, pulling herself up on the counter to sit and watch while Evelyn moved around the kitchen, talking the whole time about whatever was in her head. The fox she'd seen again by the creek, a bird's nest she'd found in the oak tree, a story she'd been making up about a girl who could talk to horses. Evelyn listened to all of it, not with the patient half-attention of an adult enduring a child's monologue, but with actual engagement, asking questions, picking up threads Sarah had dropped, occasionally adding something to the horse story that made Sarah go quiet for a moment, and then erupt with excitement because it was exactly right. Caleb watched this from the doorway one morning and felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't discomfort, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of seeing something you'd been trying to provide and failing at provided by someone else with apparent ease, and not knowing whether to be relieved or ashamed that you hadn't been able to do it yourself. Samuel was a different problem. The boy watched Evelyn the way he watched most things, carefully, from a distance, without revealing what he thought. He wasn't rude. He answered when she spoke to him, and he came to meals on time, and he did his chores without being asked, same as always. But there was a wall there, the same wall that had been there for 2 years, and Caleb had stopped expecting it to come down for anyone. What surprised him was how Evelyn handled it. She didn't try to breach the wall. She didn't apply pressure or warmth or any of the strategies Caleb had watched well-meaning women try on his son at church socials and school events. Strategies that made Samuel go quieter and more internal, like a turtle being poked at. Evelyn simply acknowledged that the wall was there and went about her business around it. She spoke to Samuel the same way she spoke to everyone, directly, without performance, assuming he was capable of understanding what she was actually saying. She asked him questions that had real answers, not the conversational filler kind. She didn't comment on his silence. On the 6th day, she asked him to help her with something. Caleb was near enough to hear it. She was at the kitchen table working on a letter. She wrote letters with some regularity, which he hadn't asked about. And she looked up when Samuel came through and said, "Samuel, do you know anything about weights and measures?" Samuel stopped. "Some," he said carefully. "I'm trying to convert a recipe from one I have that was written for a larger household. I keep second-guessing my arithmetic." She slid the notebook toward him. "Would you check my work?" Samuel looked at the notebook. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a small recalibration. He came to the table and stood beside her and looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This one's off. You need 3/4, not 2/3. "Is it?" She looked at it. "You're right. I kept getting confused by the 6." She made the correction. "Thank you." He stood there for a moment. Then he sat down at the table, which was not something he usually did unless it was a meal, and looked at the rest of the list. "This one's right," he said, pointing. "But this one, that's too much salt. That'll be bad." "How much should it be?" He thought about it with the focused expression of a child who takes arithmetic seriously. He named a measurement. Evelyn wrote it down. They went through the rest of the list together. It took about 10 minutes. And at the end, Samuel pushed the notebook back and got up from the table and went outside, same as always, unhurried and contained. But he'd sat at the table for 10 minutes. Caleb went back out to his work and didn't say anything about it. The second week was better, and the third week was better still. The house settled into a shape that was different from what it had been before, not because Evelyn had imposed something on it, but because she had simply organized what was already there into something that functioned. The mornings ran without the low-grade chaos that had characterized them before, when Caleb was trying to manage breakfast and children and his own preparation for the day's work simultaneously and doing none of it well. The evenings had meals that were eaten at the table together, which had been happening most nights anyway, but which now had a quality of actual presence to them. People talking and being heard rather than just coexisting in the same room. He noticed other things. He noticed that Samuel had started showing up in the kitchen in the late afternoons. Not for any obvious reason, just drifting in and finding something to do near the table where Evelyn was usually working. He'd do his reading there or sharpen his pencils or ask her to check his arithmetic from school, and she would, and they'd have these short functional exchanges that weren't exactly conversation but were building toward something. Caleb didn't remark on it. Remarkably, it didn't seem to need remarking on. He noticed that Sarah had asked Evelyn about her chair, in the detailed and relentless way Sarah asked about everything she was interested in, and that Evelyn had answered all of it. How it worked, how she'd gotten around before she had it, what happened when there were stairs or rough ground or places that didn't accommodate it. Sarah had listened to all of this with her full attention and then said, very seriously, "It's like you have to solve a puzzle every time you go somewhere new." And Evelyn had looked at her for a moment with an expression Caleb caught from the doorway that was something between surprise and appreciation, and said, "That's exactly what it is." And Sarah had nodded, like this was a satisfying conclusion. He noticed that his house had curtains. Not new ones. There hadn't been money for new ones, and he hadn't mentioned it and didn't intend to. But at the end of the second week, he came in from a long day and the front windows had curtains that were the ones Clara had made, which had been faded and limp for 2 years. But they had been washed and pressed and rehung, and in the evening light, they looked almost like what they used to be. He stood and looked at them for a moment, and then went to the kitchen and washed his hands and didn't say anything about them. Evelyn was at the stove and didn't look at him. The fabric's old, she said, but it's still good. They just needed cleaning. They look fine, he said. She went back to whatever she was stirring. He went to the table and sat down. The kitchen smelled like onions and something with pepper, and outside the window the light was going orange over the western hills. I want to ask you something, he said. She half turned. Go ahead. Your letters. You said you managed your father's household for 6 years. What happened after that? She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, more like someone deciding how to enter a story from the right place. My father is a particular kind of man, she said. He's not cruel in any obvious way. He doesn't shout. He doesn't raise his hand. He just makes decisions about other people's lives. He decided what I could do, where I could go, who I could speak with, what I needed. He'd decided all of that when I was 12, when I got sick and the fever took my legs, and he'd never revised his decision in 16 years. She turned back to the stove. He believed he was being kind. He probably still believes it. Caleb waited. I placed the advertisement in November, she said. I'd been planning it for about a year, saving money in small amounts over a long time. I had a woman who helped me. My mother's cousin, she lives in the city. She let me use her address for correspondence so my father's household staff wouldn't intercept it. She stirred slowly. When your ticket arrived, I left on a Tuesday morning. I told no one in the house. My father doesn't know yet where I went, though I expect he's made inquiries. You think he'll come looking? I think he will feel he's obligated to. She said it without drama, a simple fact. He'll tell himself it's because he's worried about me, and maybe part of it is. But mostly it's because I didn't ask his permission. Caleb sat with that for a moment. If he shows up, she said, that's a problem I'll deal with when it comes. It's not your problem. You're on my property. She turned to look at him then. Mr. Boon, I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm telling you the situation so you're not blindsided by it. What you do with that information is up to you. He looked at her. She was holding a wooden spoon and looking back at him with that steadiness she always had. The same steadiness she'd had on the platform that first day, and he thought about what it took to build that, to develop that kind of equilibrium, not as a pose, but as something genuine, something that had been tested and had held. I'm not going to send you back, he said. If that's what you're wondering. Something moved in her face, brief, barely there. Good, she said, and turned back to the stove. There was a night in the 3rd week that Caleb would come back to for a long time afterward, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quality of the ordinary in it. It was a Thursday. He'd been out since first light dealing with a heifer that had gotten herself tangled in the creek brush and spent 2 hours getting her free and was tired and cold and short on patience by the time he came back to the house. Samuel was at the kitchen table doing schoolwork. Sarah was somewhere upstairs, audible by the occasional thumping that communicated she was doing something she probably shouldn't. Evelyn was at the other end of the table with the mending basket, working through a pile of the children's clothes that had accumulated with the small, steady damages that children inflict on fabric. He came in, hung his coat, pulled off his boots, sat at the table. Samuel looked up. There's soup on the stove. Thanks. He didn't move immediately, just sat there with the exhaustion of the day. From upstairs came another thump. He looked at the ceiling. She's been moving her furniture, Samuel said, without looking up from his work. Why? She didn't say. A pause. She wanted the bed by the window. Caleb sighed. He'd deal with it later. He got up and got the soup, which was thick and good and had clearly been sitting on a low heat for exactly the right amount of time, and sat back down with it and ate. Evelyn didn't look up from the mending. Samuel didn't look up from his arithmetic. The lamp burned in the center of the table. The soup was hot, and it was a cold night outside, and the house was quiet except for the occasional thump from upstairs and the sound of wind finding the gaps around the back door that he needed to caulk before November. At some point, Samuel held up his paper toward Evelyn. Is this right? She looked at it. The 4th problem. You set it up right, but check the last step. Samuel looked at the paper, erased something, rewrote it, held it up again. "Yes," she said. He put the paper down and kept working. Caleb ate his soup and looked at the two of them in the lamplight, the woman at one end of the table with her mending and his son at the other end with his arithmetic, and thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago this table in the evening had been a place he sat by himself and tried not to think too hard about anything. He didn't know what to do with the comparison exactly. It sat in his chest like something he'd swallowed wrong. The month wasn't up yet. He still had the shelf. He'd set the doubt on it and left it there and hadn't looked at it in a while. And when he considered it now, it seemed smaller than it had been, though he wasn't sure if that was because the doubt itself had diminished or because other things had grown up around it and he couldn't see it as clearly. He thought about asking her to stay. Not yet. The month wasn't up, and he was not a man who acted before he'd thought something through. But the thought was there, and he noticed it, the same way he'd noticed that first evening that the house had felt different with her in it. He was getting better at noticing things and not knowing what to do with them, which was probably a form of progress, though he couldn't have said progress toward what. The shift with Samuel came at the end of the 3rd week, and when it came at an angle Caleb hadn't expected. He came back one afternoon to find them both on the porch, Samuel sitting on the steps and Evelyn beside him in her chair, both of them looking out at the yard. They weren't talking. They were just sitting there in the particular silence of two people who have arrived at a place where silence is acceptable. And Caleb almost didn't go out because something about the scene felt like it would break if he entered it. But Samuel heard him in the doorway and turned around, and Evelyn looked over, and there was nothing to do but go out. "Papa," Samuel said, "why did Mama die?" Caleb stopped. He'd been asked this before. He'd answered it before, or tried to. Fever, fast, the doctor came too late. These were the words he had for it. But Samuel's face right now had a different quality to it, and Caleb understood that this wasn't the question about facts. This was a different question with the same words. He came out and sat on the step beside his son. Evelyn stayed where she was, not drawing attention to herself, just present. "I don't know," Caleb said. "I've asked myself that a lot." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Tommy Pruitt said it was probably because we did something wrong, that God takes people when they've sinned." Tommy Pruitt doesn't know what he's talking about. But what if he's right? He's not. Caleb said it flatly. Bad things happen to good people, Samuel. It doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. It just means life is hard sometimes, and it isn't fair. Samuel processed this. "You don't know that for sure." "No," Caleb said. "I don't. But I know your mother, and there was nothing she deserved less than what happened to her." He paused. The words came harder than he expected, and he let them be hard. "She loved you. She loved Sarah. That much I know." Samuel was quiet for a long time. "Sometimes I think I made her sick," he said very quietly, "because I was bad that week. I was bad the week before she got sick." Caleb looked at his son. He understood now, the weight of it, why the boy had been carrying it, what the silence had been made of for 2 years. He felt something crack open in his chest, not painfully exactly, but the way ice gives when the temperature turns. "Samuel." He put his hand on the back of his son's neck, the way he used to when Samuel was small. "You did not make your mother sick. That is not how sickness works, not ever. And not for 1 second should you have been carrying that." Samuel didn't say anything. He didn't cry either. He was a Boon, 7 years old, and Boons apparently didn't cry easily, which was probably not ideal. But he leaned sideways slightly, just enough that his shoulder was against his father's arm, and stayed there. They sat on the porch until the light went low. Later, after the children were in bed, Caleb sat at the table and Evelyn came back to the kitchen for her evening work, and he said, without preamble, "How long had he been carrying that?" She sat down. "I don't know, but children that age, they look for reasons. When something happens they can't control, they'd rather find a reason that involves their own fault than accept that it was random, because random is more frightening than blame." Caleb stared at the table. "I should have known." "You were grieving," she said. "You were trying to keep everything running. You can't watch everything." "He's my son." "Yes," she said. "He is. And he told you tonight. That matters." He thought about that. "Did you help with that?"
getting him to ask. She was quiet for a moment. Brought it up himself. She considered it. I didn't fill the silence. Sometimes that's what's needed. Caleb looked at her. In the lamplight, she looked tired. It was late, she worked long hours, and she never said so. There were things about her he had been learning slowly, not from what she said, but from what she didn't say.
She didn't complain. She didn't ask for accommodation. When something in the house was difficult to manage from a chair, she worked around it without comment, and the only time she'd told him something was a problem was the cellar stairs, and she'd told him matter-of-factly and offered 2 possible solutions and asked his preference. "I want to talk about the arrangement," he said. She looked at him steadily. "The month isn't up yet," he said, "but I don't think I need more time." He put his hands flat on the table, a habit he had when he was saying something he wanted to say plainly. "I'd like you to stay, permanently, as my wife, if that's something you're willing to consider." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty. She wasn't someone who was uncertain often, or if she wasn't someone who showed it. It was more like the quiet of a person who has been asking themselves a question for a while and is finally letting themselves answer it. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "All right. I'm not looking to be taken care of. I'm not looking for someone to solve problems for me. I can do that myself, and I have been doing it myself for a long time." She held his gaze. "What I'm looking for is someone who sees me accurately, not someone who underestimates what I can do, and not someone who overcorrects the other way and pretends I don't have limits. Just accurately." "I've been watching you for 3 weeks," he said. "I think I have a reasonably accurate picture. And I think you're more capable than most people I've worked with. And I think you're carrying more than you show. And I think my children are better for having you here. And I think this house is better for having you in it." He said all of this in the even, straight-ahead manner in which he said most things, without looking away from her face. "That's my accurate picture." She held his gaze. Then she looked down at the table just for a moment. When she looked back up, there was something in her face that was not quite the expression she'd had before. Not her public face, not the steadiness as armor she wore so naturally he sometimes forgot it was there at all. Something a little closer to the thing underneath it. "Yes," she said. "If you're asking me honestly, yes." He nodded. He didn't reach across the table or make it into anything larger than it was. They sat for another few minutes, finishing the evening's work, and then the lamp was put out and the house went quiet, and outside the Montana dark pressed against the windows, cold and indifferent and vast. And inside the house there were 2 people who had each arrived at the other's life through necessity and accident and had found something they hadn't quite known they were looking for. It wasn't romantic in any tidy way. It wasn't resolved. There were things ahead of them that would be hard: her father, the town, the long work of 2 people learning each other's rhythms and tolerances and limits. None of that was settled. But the month wasn't up yet, and Caleb Boon had already made his decision, and Evelyn Dorset had already made hers. And in the morning, Sarah was going to ask approximately 40 questions about what this meant, and Samuel was going to sit at the kitchen table without being asked, and check the arithmetic on whatever Evelyn was working on. And the house would begin its day the way it had learned to begin it, with the ordinary noise of people who have decided, without ceremony, that they belong to each other. The news moved through Silvergate the way news always moved through small towns. Not in a straight line, but in a spiral, widening with each pass, picking up detail and distortion in equal measure. By the time Caleb and Evelyn's arrangement became known, which was roughly 4 days after they'd decided it themselves, the story the town had was only loosely related to what had actually happened. What the town had was this: the mail-order bride in the wheelchair had somehow convinced Caleb Boon to marry her, which, depending on who was telling it, meant either that she was remarkably clever or that Caleb Boon had finally lost the sense he was born with. The Pruitt sisters held the first view. Doc Marsh, who was a practical man and had seen enough of the world to know that practical people sometimes made practical decisions that looked unusual from the outside, held something closer to the second but kept it to himself. Most people fell somewhere in between, not hostile exactly, but watchful in the way of a community that has admitted something new and is waiting to see what it does.
Evelyn was aware of this. She was not unaware of much. The first time she went into town after the decision, a Thursday in mid-November, 3 weeks before the wedding they'd agreed would happen in December. She went with Caleb for the supply run, which was both practical and she suspected something Caleb had organized deliberately. He drove the wagon. She sat beside him.
When they pulled up in front of Greer's general store, he got down and came around and set the chair out without ceremony, and she got herself into it without ceremony. And they went in together, and Caleb carried the basket and she navigated the floor space between the shelves, which was tight but manageable. And they went through the list methodically and said nothing about any of it. But people watched. She felt the watching the way you feel weather when it's coming, a change in air pressure, a quality of attention. Mrs. Holt from the dry goods side came over to look at fabric samples that didn't need looking at, getting close enough to observe without appearing to observe. Two men near the seed counter had a conversation that stopped when Caleb walked past and resumed when he didn't. The woman behind the counter, whose name turned out to be Georgia Greer and whose husband owned the store, was straightforward about it. She looked at Evelyn directly and said, "You're the woman from Philadelphia." And Evelyn said yes, and Georgia Greer said, "I heard you can cook." And Evelyn said she did all right, and Georgia Greer said, "Caleb Boon burned the bottom of everything he ever made, so you can't be worse." And that was the most honest conversation Evelyn had in Silvergate for the next several weeks. The wedding was small. Caleb had not wanted a large event, and Evelyn had not wanted one either. And the two of them were in sufficient agreement on enough things by then that the decision required about 3 minutes of discussion. Justice of the peace, a Wednesday morning, the children present, nobody else invited. Though several people showed up anyway because that was the nature of small towns, and Caleb had accepted it. Sarah wore her good dress and spent the morning before the ceremony trying to arrange Evelyn's hair in a way that Evelyn gently redirected twice before arriving at something they both found acceptable. Samuel wore his good shirt and stood during the brief ceremony with the expression of a person performing a function they understand to be serious. When it was done, he looked at his father and then at Evelyn and said, formally, "Congratulations," like he was speaking to adults at a church event, which made Caleb make a sound that was almost a laugh, and which made Evelyn look at Samuel with the warm steadiness she'd developed for him specifically and say thank you. They went home afterward and had a meal that Evelyn had prepared the day before because she wasn't going to spend her wedding day cooking, which she had told Caleb plainly, and he had said, of course not. And there was good food, and the children talked too much, and the afternoon light came through Clara's curtains, and the ranch was there around them, same as always, indifferent to ceremonies but holding them just the same. Being married was not dramatically different from the weeks before. That was the honest truth of it. The shape of their days was already established. The morning work, the accounts, the children's education and meals and needs, the evening hours when the house settled into its quieter rhythms. What changed was smaller, and in some ways more significant. The permission to exist in each other's presence without the provisional quality that had colored everything before. The sense that the arrangement was no longer an arrangement, that the ground was solid now in a way it hadn't been. Caleb was not an expressive man. Evelyn had understood this from the second week, and she did not require him to be something he wasn't. He was consistent, he was honest. When she told him something was a problem, he listened, and when he told her something was a problem, she listened, and they disagreed sometimes. About the children, about the ranch finances, once about whether to sell 2 of the older horses, which became a longer conversation than either of them had intended, and ended without complete resolution and resumed the next evening and concluded differently. But they disagreed in a manner that was functional rather than corrosive, which Evelyn had learned was rarer than it had any right to be. December passed. January was cold in the way Montana January always was, which was deeply and without apology. The children were home more, which meant the house was louder, which Evelyn did not mind as much as she'd expected to. Samuel had been teaching himself something on the harmonica he'd found in the bottom of a chest. Caleb had said it was his grandfather's, and the sound moved through the house in the evenings in that tentative way of something being learned, full of hesitations and wrong notes and occasional bars that were startlingly right. Sarah had taken on the project of identifying every bird species visible from the ranch, which she conducted with the methodical intensity of a scientist,
and the cataloging instincts of a person who would someday either be very organized or drive everyone around her completely mad. She had a notebook that Evelyn had given her. She had filled 14 pages. Evelyn was teaching them both in the mornings, reading, arithmetic, some history and geography, and this was the work she found most satisfying, not because she had planned to find it satisfying, but because she had discovered that teaching was a particular kind of problem solving, the puzzle of finding the right door into a person's understanding, and she had always liked problems that required that kind of attention. Samuel had turned out to be startling with numbers, not just competent, genuinely quick, in the way of someone whose mind moved in that direction naturally. She'd figured this out by the third week of their lessons when she'd given him a problem she expected would take 20 minutes, and he'd done it in 5 and then sat there looking at her with the expression of someone waiting to be given more to do. She'd started giving him harder problems. He kept doing them. She'd written to the school in Silvergate to find out what they were covering, and when she saw the list, she'd put it aside and kept working with him at the level he was actually at, which was a year and a half ahead of where his age said he should be. She hadn't mentioned this to Caleb immediately. She'd wanted to be sure of what she was seeing before she said it. But one evening, in late January, she put the notebook with Samuel's work in front of Caleb and said, "You should look at this." He looked. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "He's always been good with numbers." "He's not just good," she said. "He's exceptional. He should have someone who can properly teach him." Caleb looked at the notebook again. "There's no one in Silvergate." "I know, but there may be correspondence courses. There are programs in the cities, some by mail. I've been looking into it." She had in fact been writing letters for 3 weeks to various educational institutions and had received 2 responses so far, both promising. Caleb looked at her. "When did you start doing that?" "When I figured out what I was dealing with." She said it matter-of-factly. "He has a particular kind of mind, Caleb. It needs feeding." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him arriving at something. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "His mother was good with numbers too," he said. "He has more of her than he knows," Evelyn said. Caleb closed the notebook and slid it back across the table. "Do whatever you think is right. You know him better in some ways than I do, and I'm not too proud to say so." That was the kind of thing he said sometimes, direct and without self-pity, just honest about where his limits were. She had found that she respected it more than she'd respected most things people said. February arrived with a thaw in the middle of it that was deceptive, the way February thaws always were. Warm for 5 days, and then winter came back harder, and the creek that had started to open froze again, and there was a week of cold that kept everyone close to the house. It was during this week that Evelyn began to understand the particular restlessness of a Montana winter, the way it pressed in, the way the days felt like the same day repeated with small variations. She was not, by nature, someone who needed to be busy for the sake of being busy, but she was someone who needed to be useful. And there were days in that February stretch where she sat at the table and felt the edges of something that was not quite despair, but was adjacent to it. The awareness of her own limits in a landscape that did not accommodate limits gracefully. She didn't mention it to Caleb. She'd have been hard-pressed to explain it in a way that would be useful rather than worrying, and she didn't want to be worried about. She handled it the way she handled most things, by finding something that needed doing and doing it. She reorganized the supply storage system in the kitchen, which she'd been intending to do for months. She wrote 4 letters. She made a detailed ledger of the spring planting and supply needs. She taught Samuel something about basic geometry that he absorbed in 2 afternoons and immediately started applying to the structure of things around the ranch, which prompted a conversation with Caleb that went on for an hour about fence angles and load-bearing distances, and left Caleb looking at his son with the quiet expression of someone recalibrating. March came, and with it the legitimate beginning of thaw, and the ranch came back to life in the way ranches do in spring, everything at once and all of it urgent. Caleb was out before light most days. The children were restless with the energy that accumulates over a winter and needed to be pointed somewhere. The days were long and full, and the particular heaviness of February lifted like it always did. It was a Thursday afternoon in late March when it happened. Caleb had been in the south pasture since morning, dealing with the fence section that the winter had wrecked along the creek embankment.
He wouldn't be back until evening. Samuel was at school. Silvergate had a school that ran 4 days a week, and that Caleb had been sending the twins to since September, though Evelyn supplemented it heavily. Sarah had come home early because the teacher, a young man named Mr. Forrest, who was conscientious but overextended, had sent the younger children home at noon to deal with a problem with the older students that Evelyn didn't know the details of. So it was just the two of them in the early afternoon. Evelyn at the kitchen table with the accounts, Sarah somewhere in the side yard. Then Sarah wasn't somewhere in the side yard. She was at the back of the yard, near the old well that Caleb didn't use anymore, and that was covered with a wooden board that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. The yard backed up to a stretch of grass that ran toward the creek, and in spring the grass was high there and warm and full of the things that liked warmth. Evelyn didn't hear anything at first. Then she heard the sound that made every piece of her attention snap to the same point at the same time. Sarah's voice. Not a shout. Something under a shout, tight and high and very still. Evelyn. Evelyn was out the back door before she'd finished deciding to move. The back door opened onto 2 steps down to the yard, and then a stretch of packed dirt that was manageable. She'd had the route figured out since the first week. She came around the corner of the house and saw Sarah immediately, and she saw why Sarah wasn't moving. The rattlesnake was between Sarah and the back porch. 4 feet of it, maybe a little more, coiled in the grass at the edge of the dirt where the afternoon sun had warmed the ground, and its head was up and tracking and the rattle was going. That particular dry sound that cuts through everything else and tells you with absolute certainty that there is no other sound in the world right now. Sarah was frozen 3 feet from it, too close to back away without triggering a strike, her arms down at her sides and her eyes very wide and her face the particular white of a child who has understood something very fast. She had not looked at Evelyn yet. She was keeping her eyes on the snake the way you keep your eyes on something that you understand is the only thing that matters right now. Don't move, Evelyn said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her slightly. Sarah, don't move anything, just breathe. I know, Sarah whispered. Her voice shook slightly on the second word. Evelyn's mind was running through it, fast, the way it ran through problems, which was the only way she knew how to think about any of this. She was 8 feet from the snake. The shovel was on the far side of the barn. Caleb's rifle was inside, in the front room, which was the length of the house away. She couldn't outrun a strike. She couldn't reach Sarah without crossing the snake's range, and the sound of a moving chair on the dry ground would pull the snake's attention. She had to think. She looked at what she had. She was at the edge of the yard near the back porch, which put the old water barrel beside her, and on the porch railing, the 3 glass ink bottles she'd brought out that morning to take inventory of because she'd been planning to write letters in the afternoon and wanted to know how much ink was left. 3 glass bottles, 8 feet. An angle that put her to the snake's left, slightly behind where its attention was fixed on Sarah. She had thrown things before, not accurately, not particularly well. She'd had a childhood before the fever that had included other children and games and the ordinary physical education of a girl in the 1860s. She was not an athlete. She had not thrown anything with accuracy in 20 years. She reached for the nearest bottle. Sarah, she said, keeping her voice very quiet, very even, I need you to trust me. When I say duck, I need you to drop straight down as fast as you can. Not back, not sideways, straight down. Can you do that? Yes. A whisper. You're sure? Yes. The snake's rattle was steady. Its head moved slightly. It was tracking something, maybe both of them, maybe the vibration of Evelyn's chair on the ground. She had maybe seconds before it decided. She picked up the bottle. She felt the weight of it. She looked at the snake's head. She thought about the angle and the distance and the fact that she had no real reason to believe she could make this throw, and then she stopped thinking about that because thinking about it was not going to help anything. She said, "Duck." Sarah dropped. Evelyn threw. The bottle left her hand in a low arc, not overhand, which she didn't have the room for, but a hard flat throw from beside her chair, the way you throw something when you need it to cover distance fast. She felt it leave her hand wrong, too far to the left, and she was already reaching for the second bottle because she was going to need it. The first bottle hit the ground 6 inches from the snake's head and shattered. The snake struck at the noise and the glass and the sudden flash of it and struck ground and recoiled, and the rattle shifted. And Evelyn threw the second bottle directly at the snake's body. This one hit, not perfectly, not cleanly, but it hit the snake at the midpoint and the glass broke across it, and the impact was enough. The snake uncoiled away from Sarah, away from the broken glass, moving fast through the grass toward the creek side of the yard and gone in 3 seconds. Evelyn was already moving toward Sarah. The girl had not moved from where she'd dropped. She was crouched in the dirt with her arms over her head and she was shaking. Evelyn reached her and put her hand on the back of Sarah's head and said, "It's gone. Sarah, look at me. It's gone." Sarah looked up. Her face was still white and she was shaking badly and her eyes were wet, and she stared at Evelyn for a second like she was trying to confirm something, and then she said, "You hit it." "I hit it." "You hit the snake with an ink bottle." "With 2 ink bottles." She pushed the hair back from Sarah's face and looked at her hands and her arms. No bite marks. The snake hadn't touched her. "Are you hurt anywhere?" "No." Sarah's voice was still shaking. "No, I was just standing there and it was just there and I didn't know what to—" She stopped. The shaking was working its way through her whole body. "That's all right," Evelyn said. "That was the right thing to do. You held still and you listened. That's what saved you." She kept her hand on Sarah's back. "Come here." Sarah came forward and put her arms around Evelyn's neck and held on, and Evelyn held her back, held her the way you hold something you were afraid of losing, with the full weight of relief in it, the kind of relief that has a specific quality when you understand how close it was. They stayed that way for a while. The afternoon sun was warm on the yard. Somewhere near the creek, a bird was making noise. The glass from the ink bottles was scattered in the dirt in 2 rough circles, and the grass where the snake had gone was still. Sarah pulled back eventually. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the broken glass. "Are those the bottles from the porch?" "Yes." "Were they full?" "One of them was." Sarah looked at the grass where the ink had spread over the dirt and the glass. "That's going to stain," she said. Evelyn looked at it. "Yes," she said, "it is." And then, without entirely planning to, she started laughing. Not the polite kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere you weren't expecting and arrives before you can stop it. And Sarah looked at her for a surprised second, and then she started laughing too. The shaky leftover laughter of someone whose system is trying to discharge something it had been holding. And they sat there in the backyard of the Boon Ranch with broken glass and spilled ink around them and laughed. Caleb came back 2 hours later. Evelyn had swept up the glass, and Sarah had cleaned the ink as best as it could be cleaned, and they had agreed, wordlessly, not to have made it into a story yet. When Caleb came through the kitchen door, they were at the table, Evelyn with the accounts and Sarah with her bird notebook. And he looked at them and said, "All right?" In the way he said it when nothing seemed immediately wrong, but something in the air was different. "We had some excitement," Evelyn said. She told him. She told it plainly, without drama, the same way she told everything. What happened, in what order, what she did. Caleb listened to all of it without saying anything. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Sarah. "You held still." "She told me to." "You did the right thing." He looked at Evelyn. "And you threw a glass bottle at a rattlesnake." 2 bottles. 2 bottles. He said it in a tone she couldn't entirely read. "It was what I had," she said. He was quiet again for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." It was 2 words. He said it the same way he said most things, directly, without ornamentation. But the weight behind it was something else. He said thank you the way a man says it when he means something much larger than the words. When the words are a container that is too small for what he's trying to put in them, and he knows it and says them anyway because they're what he has. Evelyn looked at him. "She's fine," she said. "We're both fine." He nodded. He went to Sarah and put his hand on top of her head for a moment, the way he did, brief and solid, his version of an embrace. Sarah leaned into it. He let his hand rest there for a second longer than usual. The story moved through town faster than Evelyn would have anticipated, which said something about the particular velocity of information in Silvergate.
It got there through Samuel, who had heard it at dinner that evening and gone to school the next day, and who was not prone to exaggeration but had the story straight and told it straight, and the story spread from there in the reliable way of something that contains a genuine surprise. The reaction was not what Evelyn had expected. She'd expected the town to hear it and file it somewhere, noted, acknowledged, moved on. What happened instead was subtler and took longer, but it was real. She started to notice it in small ways in the days after. Georgia Greer at the general store, who had always been direct but not particularly warm, asked her how she was getting on and meant it. The woman from the feed store, Mabel Whitmore, she'd learned by then, nodded at her on the street with the nod you give a person you've revised your opinion of upward. Doc Marsh stopped by the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to check on a horse that had had a chest cough earlier in the season, and the horse was fine, but he stayed for coffee and talked to Evelyn for 30 minutes about education, which she would learn was one of his particular interests. And when he left, he shook her hand and called her Mrs. Boon, which was not something she was entirely used to yet. It wasn't a transformation. The Pruitt sisters still had opinions. There were still people in Silvergate who looked at her the way they'd always looked at her, as an anomaly, a problem that hadn't resolved itself the way they'd expected. She was not naive enough to think that one afternoon with a rattlesnake had changed the fundamental fact of what she looked like to people who had already decided what she was. But something had shifted. She could feel the difference in weight, the way you feel the difference in a room when the air pressure changes before a storm. The story had done what stories do. It had given people something they could hold on to, a concrete thing that replaced the abstract category of woman in wheelchair with a specific woman who had done a specific thing in a specific moment. That was harder to dismiss than the abstract. What she didn't anticipate was how it would change something between her and Caleb. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden declaration or a shift in how they talked to each other. It was closer to the removal of something that had been between them. Not a wall, because there had never been a wall exactly, but a certain carefulness, a slight measure of reserve that she hadn't named because it was so consistent, she'd stopped noticing it. She noticed its absence. He was different in small ways. He came inside for lunch now instead of eating in the barn. He talked to her about the ranch, not just the accounts and the decisions that required her input, but the running of it, the daily texture of it, the fence in the south pasture, and his concerns about the water level in the near creek and the heifer he was watching that had been off her feed for 2 days. He talked to her about it the way you talk to someone you have decided is actually present, actually someone you share a life with, rather than someone you have made a practical arrangement with. He asked her things, not just about the house or the children, but about her. What had she wanted to be once? What did she think about? He asked these things in his particular way, not one evening over a deliberate conversation, but here and there, at odd moments, while he was doing something else, as though the questions came to him and he'd stopped censoring them. She answered honestly. She told him she'd wanted to study things that still hadn't gone away. She told him that one of the things she found most satisfying about the accounts was the structure of it, the way numbers described something real about the world if you knew how to read them. She told him about the woman in Philadelphia, her mother's cousin Margaret, who had smuggled books to her for years, and who was the reason she could do half the things she did. He listened to all of this. One evening, about 2 weeks after the rattlesnake, she had started using that as a private benchmark, before and after the snake. He came in from the barn later than usual, and she was at the table, and he sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly." "All right. Are you happy here?" She looked at him. It was a direct question, and he was looking at her directly, and she understood it was not rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to know, and he was capable of handling an answer that wasn't simple. "Most of the time," she said. "Yes." "And the rest of the time?" She thought about it. "There are days when the world is small," she said, "when there are things I can't reach and I feel the limit of it. That's not particular to here. It's always been true. But yes, sometimes." She held his gaze. "That doesn't mean I'm unhappy here. They're not the same thing." He nodded slowly, like someone adding something to an internal picture and finding it fits. "What about you?" she asked. He seemed slightly surprised that she'd turned it back, which said something about how often people asked him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "I spent a long time just getting through," he said, "day to day. I'd stopped expecting more than that." He paused. "That's different now." She waited. "I don't know what I expected when I placed that advertisement," he said. "I know I didn't expect you." He said the last part without particular weight. It was just a fact, plain and honest. "No," she agreed. "I'd guess you didn't." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "No," he said, "I didn't." They sat there for a while in the quiet of the evening kitchen, the lamp between them, the sounds of the children upstairs working their way down through the ceiling. Sarah's voice at some indeterminate volume, Samuel's harmonica picking out a phrase and then stopping and starting again. The house around them was alive in the way it had learned to be alive. And Caleb Boon sat across the table from his wife and said nothing else, and she said nothing else, and neither of them needed to, because some things are communicated in the keeping of silence more clearly than they could be communicated any other way. It was a good period. She would know that later. She would recognize, looking back, that those weeks in late March and early April had the quality of things being genuinely well, not perfectly, not without friction or difficulty, but genuinely well in the way that is real and earned, rather than just the absence of disaster. She should have known it wouldn't last, not because she was pessimistic by nature, but because she was a practical woman. And practical women understand that the world does not offer sustained good periods without cost, and the cost comes from wherever you are least expecting it, and when it comes fast. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It came in the regular post from Silvergate, in an envelope that Evelyn recognized before she turned it over. She had been getting her mail through Margaret's address in Philadelphia for years, and Margaret forwarded things when they needed forwarding, and the letters that came from that route were usually Margaret's own correspondence, or the educational institution responses she'd been waiting for, or occasionally something else. This was something else. She recognized her father's handwriting on the inner envelope before she got it fully open. She recognized it the way you recognize something you grew up with. Not pleasantly, just accurately, with the particular quality of recognition that has no warmth in it. She sat in the kitchen for a while after she read it. The children were at school. Caleb was in the far pasture. The house was quiet around her in the way it was quiet when she was alone in it, which was a different quality of quiet from the evening quiet, more empty, less at rest. The letter was not long. Her father was not a man who wasted words. It said, essentially, that he knew where she was, that he intended to come, that he did not consider her situation legitimate, a word he underlined once, and that he had engaged the services of a legal advisor regarding the matter of her welfare. Her welfare. She set the letter on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she folded it back into its envelope and put it in the drawer where she kept things that required attention, and went back to the accounts, because the accounts were there and they needed doing, and because she had learned a very long time ago that you do not let fear eat the whole afternoon. She told Caleb that evening, after the children were in bed. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face didn't change much while he was reading, but his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was dealing with something he didn't like. When he was done, he set it on the table between them and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. "He's coming here," he said. "That's what it says." "Does he know how far Montana is from Philadelphia?" "He knows. He's made long journeys before when he decided something needed doing." She kept her voice even. "He's not a man who is deterred by distance." Caleb was quiet. "What does he mean, the matter of your welfare?" "He means he thinks I'm not capable of being here, of being a wife and running a household and making decisions about my own life." She said it without bitterness. It was just accurate. "He's believed that since I was 12. He has 16 years of practice believing it. And a legal advisor." "Yes." "What does that mean, practically?" She'd thought about this on and off all afternoon while she was doing the accounts, in the background of her mind where she runs the things she doesn't want to think about directly. "I don't fully know," she said honestly. "In some states there are provisions for guardianship arrangements, for people deemed incapable of self-management. He's tried before, in a milder way, to establish that I require his oversight. He never succeeded, but he has money, and he has lawyers, and he has very firm beliefs about what I need." Caleb looked at the letter, then at her. "This is my house," he said. "You are my wife. He has no standing here. He may argue otherwise. He can argue whatever he wants." His voice had the flat quality it got when he was past the point of being negotiated with. "He doesn't come here and make decisions about your life. Not from this house." She looked at him. She felt something that she didn't have an immediate word for, not relief exactly, not surprise, because she'd known by then who Caleb Boon was, and she'd known he wouldn't fold on this. It was closer to the feeling of standing on ground you'd been testing your weight on for months, and finally knowing it was solid all the way down. "It may be complicated," she said. "I want you to understand what you're taking on." "I understand what I'm taking on. Caleb, Evelyn," his voice was level. "I'm not going to talk you out of being worried. You know your father and I don't, but I want to be clear about where I stand, and where I stand is that you are not going back to Philadelphia, and nobody is making decisions about your welfare except you." He held her gaze. "That clear?" "Yes," she said. "That's clear." He picked up the letter, folded it, and put it back in the envelope. He set it in the center of the table like it was an invoice he'd received and was choosing to address in its proper order. "We should talk to someone in Silvergate about the legal side. Doc Marsh knows people. I'll ask him this week." She nodded. "And in the meantime," he said, "we run the ranch. The accounts get done. The children go to school. Nothing stops." She looked at him across the table. This man she'd married, who burned biscuits and fixed fences and had spent 4 years just getting through and had let her into his house with something between doubt and hope, and had arrived, without ceremony, at something that functioned and mattered. Who sat now in his kitchen at the end of the day and said nothing stops like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Nothing stops," she agreed. Outside, the Montana spring night was clear and cold, and the stars were out in the particular abundance they got this far from any city. And somewhere in the east pasture, a horse moved through the dark grass, and the house held what it held: the sleeping children, the lamp on the kitchen table, 2 people who had built something and were going to keep building it, whatever came next. Doc Marsh's full name was Edmund Marsh, and he had been practicing medicine in Silvergate for 11 years, which meant he had delivered most of the children currently in the school and had attended most of the adults currently in the cemetery. And he had learned through this work a particular quality of patience that was different from passivity. It was the patience of someone who understood that human situations rarely resolve the way you wanted them to, and that your job was to be useful within that fact rather than despite it. He came to the ranch the Thursday after Caleb asked him, on a morning when the air had the particular clarity of an early April day that hasn't made up its mind yet between winter and spring. He read the letter at the kitchen table while Caleb stood by the window, and Evelyn sat across from him, and when he was done, he set it down and took off his reading glasses and cleaned them with the same methodical care he applied to most things. "His name is Arthur Dorset," Evelyn said. "He owns a textile concern in Philadelphia. He's not an insignificant man." "What kind of lawyer does he have?" "I don't know specifically. The man he used in Philadelphia when he tried before was a probate attorney. He dealt in estates and incompetency proceedings." Marsh put his glasses back on. "And the attempt in Philadelphia? What came of it?" "Nothing formal. I had Margaret's help, my mother's cousin. She has some connections, and she knew the right people to speak to. It cost him some embarrassment, and he didn't press it." She kept her hands folded on the table. "But that was in his city. This is different." Marsh looked at the letter again. "The word he uses, welfare, that's deliberate. That's the language of guardianship claims." He looked at Evelyn directly. "In Montana Territory, the law on this is not well settled. We don't have the case history that the eastern states have. That cuts both ways. It means he can't easily import eastern precedent, but it also means there's less to protect you if a local judge decides he's sympathetic to a wealthy man's concern for his disabled daughter." "Who's the judge?" Caleb asked. "Territorial level? It would be Judge Hale in Helena. Local matters, it would go to Alderman Pryor." Marsh paused. "Pryor is practical. He doesn't like complications. A man who comes from Philadelphia with money and lawyers would be a complication he'd want to resolve quickly, which could go either direction."
He looked between the two of them. What I'd suggest is getting ahead of this before Dorset arrives. There's an attorney in Helena named Graves who handles territorial property and domestic matters. He's the man you want. I can write to him this week. Do that, Caleb said. Marsh looked at Evelyn. In the meantime, is there anything in your circumstances that your father could point to as evidence of incapacity? Finances in disarray, household matters unmanaged, anything that could be used to suggest you're not running your own affairs? Evelyn looked at him. The ranch accounts are current for the first time in 4 years. The household is organized. I've been corresponding with the Territorial Education Office regarding Samuel's mathematics instruction. I bake my own bread and I manage my own correspondence, and I teach 2 children 5 mornings a week. She said it without heat. No, there is nothing. Marsh almost smiled. Good. He stood, folding the letter and handing it back to her. Keep that. Keep copies of the account ledgers, the correspondence, anything that documents how the household runs. If this goes before anyone, you want evidence that speaks before you do. After Marsh left, Evelyn sat at the table for a while. The morning was quiet. The children were at school. Caleb had gone back to the south pasture. She looked at the letter on the table and thought about her father in the specific way she allowed herself to think about him sometimes. Not with the weight of everything, just clearly, as a person with particular qualities and limitations. Arthur Dorset was 63 years old. He was a careful man, a deliberate man, a man who had built his business through a combination of genuine intelligence and an absolute conviction that he understood the nature of things better than the people around him. He was not wrong often. That was part of the problem. He was right about enough things that his certainty had been reinforced across decades, until it was essentially structural, the way a beam becomes load-bearing, so integral to the building that removing it would cause collapse. He had been certain, from the day the doctor told him Evelyn would not walk again, that her life was now a smaller thing than it had been, that it needed to be managed, that she needed to be protected from a world that would not accommodate her, and that this protection was his responsibility, and more than that, his right. She had spent 16 years trying to explain to him, not in those words, not directly, because direct confrontation with Arthur Dorset was like trying to redirect a river, that the protection was also a prison. That his certainty about what she needed had never included asking her what she needed. That she was not a smaller thing. That she had never been a smaller thing. He would not have understood the distinction, and she had stopped believing he ever would. She put the letter back in the drawer and went to work. The letter from the Helena attorney arrived 10 days later. His name was actually Gideon Graves, and he wrote with the compressed clarity of a man who charged by the word and wanted you to understand exactly what you were paying for. The situation, he wrote, was manageable but required attention. Montana Territory recognized the legal standing of married women in matters of household management and property. A guardianship claim brought by a non-resident against a married woman in her husband's household would face significant procedural obstacles. However, the presence of a sympathetic judge and sufficient money could create problems that were better prevented than contested. He would represent them if engaged and recommended engagement promptly. Caleb wrote back that same day engaging him. Evelyn wrote to Margaret in Philadelphia that same week, not to ask for help. Margaret had done enough, and the distances were too great for Margaret's connections to reach. But because Margaret deserved to know what was happening, and because writing to her was the closest thing Evelyn had to speaking to someone who had known her for her entire adult life. Margaret wrote back in 12 days, which was fast for the postal distance, which meant she had written the same day she received Evelyn's letter. The letter was characteristic Margaret, direct, warm, furious in a controlled way. Your father left Philadelphia on April the 14th, she wrote. He traveled with his attorney, a man named Corbin. I tried to delay matters. I was not successful. He is determined and he believes himself to be right, which, as you know, makes him very nearly unstoppable. But you are also determined, Evie, and you have always known you were right. And I have believed for many years that when those two qualities finally collided directly, the outcome would not favor him. I am sorry you are the one who has to be the collision. Evelyn read this letter 3 times. Then she put it in the drawer with the other one and went to dinner. Arthur Dorset arrived in Silvergate on a Wednesday in the second week of May. He arrived on the afternoon train, which was the same train Evelyn had arrived on 7 months before, and he stepped onto the same platform, and several of the same people were there in various capacities of daily life who had been there when Evelyn arrived. They would remark on this later, the coincidence of it, the particular symmetry. He was a tall man, straight-backed, with gray at his temples, and the kind of clothing that communicated money in a restrained way. He had a traveling case and a companion, his attorney, Corbin, who was younger, thin-faced, with quick eyes and the bearing of someone who had been trained to move efficiently through rooms that were not built for him. They went to the hotel on Front Street, which was Silvergate's only hotel, and which had 4 rooms and a dining area that Georgia Greer's cousin managed with varying degrees of success. By the time they'd been there an hour, the town knew who they were. By the time they'd been there 2 hours, the town had a reasonably accurate account of why they were there. An opinion had begun forming with the reliable speed of public opinion in a place where new information was a limited commodity. Caleb heard about it from Samuel, who heard it at school from Tommy Pruitt, who had apparently gotten the information from his father, who had been at the feed store when someone who'd talked to someone who'd seen them come off the train came in to report. The chain of information was as reliable as such chains ever were, which was partially. He told Evelyn that evening. She took it without visible reaction. "He'll send word," she said. "That's how he operates. He'll want a meeting somewhere neutral before he comes here." "He's not coming here," Caleb said. She looked at him. "He will eventually. Keeping him from the property won't help our position. It'll look defensive." "I don't care how it looks." "I do," she said evenly. "If this goes before anyone, I need to look like a woman who has nothing to hide in her own home, not a woman whose husband is keeping her father from the door." She held his gaze. "I know this is hard for you, but let me manage it, Caleb. I know him better than you do." He didn't like it. She could see he didn't like it. He stood there in the kitchen with that jaw-set expression that meant he was dealing with something his instincts told him to handle differently than his reason said to, and she waited for him to work through it because she'd learned that was the only way. "Fine," he said, "but I'm in any meeting he wants." "Yes, that's fine." The word came the next morning, a letter delivered to the ranch by one of the Pruitt boys, who had clearly been paid to carry it, and who waited with professional patience while Evelyn read it and composed her response. Her father requested a meeting at the hotel dining room at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. She wrote back confirming. She spent the intervening day doing her regular work. This was not performance. She genuinely found that it was the most useful thing to do. The ledgers needed updating. Samuel had a mathematics question she'd been meaning to address. There was bread that needed making and 2 letters she'd been putting off writing. She did all of these things with her usual focus, and if her mind ran the coming meeting in background parallel, she didn't let it move to the foreground until the evening. When the children were in bed and Caleb sat across the table from her with a cup of coffee, he wasn't really drinking. "Tell me about him," Caleb said. She thought about how to describe Arthur Dorset to a man like Caleb Boon. They were, in a certain sense, both men of a type, practical, direct, accustomed to knowing what they were doing and why. But the similarity ended there. Her father's practicality lived in the world of business and management. He understood systems, capital, leverage. He understood less well the things that couldn't be managed from above. "He'll be reasonable in public," she said. "He won't raise his voice. He'll be polite to you, which will feel insulting because the politeness will carry the implication that you've been taken advantage of, that you married me without fully understanding what you were taking on, and that he's here to help you understand." She held Caleb's gaze. "He'll try to make me a problem you have that he can solve. Don't let him reframe it that way." "What do I do instead?" "Be specific. Every time he makes an abstract claim, she can't manage, she's not capable, this isn't appropriate for someone in her condition, you come back with a specific thing. She manages our accounts, she runs the household, she teaches our children, she saved our daughter's life." She said it plainly, without drama. Abstractions are what he lives in. They're harder to fight. Specifics are what he doesn't have. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this for a long time." "Since I was about 15, she said. "Yes." The hotel dining room was empty except for them when they arrived the next afternoon. 2 o'clock on a Thursday, the lunch crowd long gone, and the dinner crowd 2 hours away. Georgia Greer's cousin had set one of the tables near the window with a cloth and 4 chairs, which was more ceremony than the room usually saw. Her father was already there when they came in. He stood when he saw them. He was exactly as she remembered. The straight back, the careful expression, the quality of controlled attention that made you feel, in his presence, that you were being assessed. He looked at Evelyn first, the way he always looked at her first, with something that was genuinely relief mixed with something she had never been able to name, something that was not quite possessiveness and not quite love, but that occupied the space between them. "Evelyn," he said. "Father," she said. Her voice was steady. She had trained it to be steady in his presence since she was 17. His eyes went to Caleb, then back to her, then to Caleb again. He extended his hand. "Mr. Boon, Arthur Dorset." "I know who you are," Caleb said. He shook the hand without warmth. "Caleb Boon." The attorney Corbin was at the other chair with a leather case on the table in front of him. He had the expression of a man trying to read a room and not being entirely sure what he was reading. They sat. Her father looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd spent her adult life trying to decode, the one that contained, somewhere in it, genuine care and genuine certainty simultaneously and couldn't separate the two. "You look well," he said. "I am well. I'm glad." He seemed to mean it. That was always the hardest part. He meant things, and what he meant was often, in isolation, decent. It was the architecture of his meaning that caused the damage. "Evelyn, I want you to understand that I'm not here to cause difficulty. I'm here because I have responsibilities. You left without—" "I left," she said, "because I'm 28 years old and I am entitled to make decisions about my own life." "You left without a word." "Because if I'd said a word, you would have prevented it." She said it without raising her voice. "We both know that's true. Let's not spend the afternoon pretending otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. This was one of the things she'd always known about him. He could take a direct hit without visibly reacting, and then he'd come back to his position from a different angle. "I understand you feel constrained," he said. "I understand that you wanted independence. I respect that desire, Evelyn. I always have. But there's a difference between independence and—" "Between independence and what?" she said. "Between independence and what I have right now? I manage this household. I run the accounts. I teach the children. I make decisions every day about how things are done and what is needed and what comes next. What would independence look like that I am not already doing?" Corbin had opened his leather case and taken out a document. He set it on the table without saying anything. Evelyn looked at it. She didn't touch it. "What is that?" "It's a petition," her father said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "For a temporary guardianship arrangement, it's standard procedure when there are concerns about—" "About what?" Caleb said. His voice was even, but there was no warmth in it at all. "My wife runs our household and manages our finances and taught our daughter how to stay still while a rattlesnake was 3 feet from her face and then threw glass bottles at it until it left. What exactly are your concerns?" Her father looked at Caleb. Something moved in his expression. Not offense, more like recalibration. He hadn't expected that. "Mr. Boon, I understand that you believe—" "I don't believe anything," Caleb said. "I live with her. I see what she does. There's nothing to believe. I'm telling you what's true." He put his hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was saying something he meant. "Your daughter kept my books straight for the first time in 4 years. Your daughter figured out that my son has been carrying his mother's death as his own fault for 2 years and got him talking again. Your daughter is why this ranch functions and why my children are doing better than they have been in a long time." He held Arthur Dorset's gaze without blinking. "If there's a guardianship concern in this situation, I'm not sure I know what it's aimed at." The room was quiet. Corbin looked at the document on the table. Her father looked at Caleb and then at Evelyn, and something in his expression was shifting. Not dramatically, not in any way that resolved anything, but she could see it, the small crack in the certainty, the way it moved. "These are serious claims," Corbin said. He was apparently deciding it was his moment to be useful. "The petition is based on the original medical assessments and the history of—" Those assessments are 25 years old, Evelyn said. She looked at him directly. My disability has not changed. What has changed is everything else, which apparently wasn't part of the assessment. She turned back to her father. Tell me what you're actually afraid of, she said. Her voice dropped slightly. Not softer, just more direct. Not what the petition says, not what Corbin says the law allows. What you're afraid of. Because I think that's the real conversation. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Corbin looked at him. The afternoon light came through the window at a flat angle and lit the table between them. Outside, a wagon went past on Front Street. Normal Thursday afternoon in Silvergate. I'm afraid you'll need something, her father said finally, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it in a long time. Something stripped of the management, of the architecture. I'm afraid there will be something you need, and there will be no one to, that you'll be somewhere far from everything, and something will happen, and... He stopped. He was not a man who stopped often. He looked at the table. She looked at her father. 63 years old. A man who had sat in a doctor's office in 1863 and been told his daughter would not walk again and had translated that moment, in the particular way his mind worked, into a project that had consumed 16 years. She had spent those years being angry at the project and had rarely thought about the moment that generated it. Something happened, she said. Something already happened. I was in the yard alone with a 7-year-old girl, and there was a rattlesnake, and nobody was there to help, and I handled it. She held his gaze. I handled it, Father. Not someone else. Me. That's what you don't have a category for. Not because it isn't true, but because you decided a long time ago it couldn't be. And you've been living inside that decision ever since. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the window. The petition, Evelyn said. I'd like you to withdraw it. Corbin started to say something. Her father raised a hand briefly, and Corbin stopped. If I do, her father said slowly, I need to know. He stopped again. He was fighting with something, and she could see it, and she had the strange experience for the first time of feeling something other than anger or exhaustion where her father was concerned. I need to know that you're not... He seemed to genuinely not have the word for it. That I'm not what? That you're not somewhere being... That this is real. That this is actually what you want and not something you arrived at because you had no other options. She looked at him for a long time. This is real, she said. This is the most real thing I've ever had. And I have it because I left. Not because you let me go, because I left. She didn't let the weight of that land wrong. She said it precisely, not as accusation, but as fact. I need you to hear the difference. He heard it. She could see him hear it, the way it moved through his expression and settled somewhere. Withdraw the petition, she said again. The silence that followed was the longest kind, the kind that isn't empty but full, packed with the sediment of 16 years of a particular relationship, all the things that had been said and the larger weight of things that hadn't. Corbin looked at the document on the table with the expression of a man whose professional services were becoming less relevant by the moment. All right, her father said. The word came out quietly. Not defeated. That wasn't the right word for Arthur Dorset, who did not experience defeat in recognizable forms. More like a man who has run a long calculation and arrived at a result that contradicts his assumption, and who is deciding, with difficulty, to trust the calculation. Corbin looked at his client. Mr. Dorset, I'd advise to... Withdraw it, her father said. To Corbin, not to her. Draw up the withdrawal and I'll sign it today. Corbin closed the leather case. In the days that followed, the town of Silvergate did what small towns do when something significant happens. It processed the event in installments, through conversation and opinion and the slow revision of standing views. The news that Arthur Dorset had withdrawn his petition traveled with the same velocity as his arrival, which was total and immediate. By Thursday evening, most of Silvergate knew the substance of what had happened, and opinion was running strongly in a particular direction. It was Georgia Greer who said it most directly, to 3 women in the general store on Friday morning, and who said it in a voice that was not attempting to be overheard, but not going out of its way to prevent it. Man came all this way to decide whether his daughter could run her own life, and his daughter ran a meeting that sent him home without his petition. I don't know what more you need to see." Nobody in the store disagreed. The Pruitt sisters continued to have reservations, because the Pruitt sisters always had reservations, and would have them until one or both of them stopped having anything at all. But even their reservations were of a different quality now, more textured, less certain. The reservations of people who are working to maintain a position rather than of people who find the position natural. Her father stayed 3 more days in Silvergate, which Evelyn had not entirely expected. On the second day, he came to the ranch. She had known he would. She'd thought about whether to tell Caleb in advance and had decided yes. And Caleb had said all right and had not said anything else about it until her father's wagon came up the road, at which point he had come in from the barn and washed his hands and stood in the kitchen with the expression of a man prepared to be civil as long as civility was warranted. Her father came onto the porch and stopped at the top of the steps. He looked at the yard, the barn, the fencing, the garden she'd started along the south side, the oak tree at the corner with its new spring leaves. He looked at the house with the attention of a man who looks at things and registers what they tell him. Then he came in. She made coffee because it was the thing to do. Caleb sat at the table and answered her father's questions about the ranch with the directness he brought to most things, and her father asked them with what she recognized as genuine interest rather than assessment. He was a man who liked to understand how things worked. They talked about the cattle operation and the fence situation along the creek embankment and the question of whether to expand the herd in the fall. And she sat with her coffee and watched 2 men who had almost nothing in common find in the concrete territory of land and livestock and practical decision-making, something they could actually talk about. Samuel came home from school while her father was there. He came into the kitchen, stopped when he saw the stranger, and looked at his father. "This is my father," Evelyn said. "Samuel, this is Mr. Dorset." Samuel looked at the old man with his characteristic careful appraisal. "Are you the one who sent the petition?" he said. Caleb looked at the ceiling briefly. Evelyn did not react. Her father looked at Samuel for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Did you withdraw it?" "Yes." Samuel considered this. "Good," he said, and went through to put his school bag down. Her father watched him go. When Samuel was out of the room, he looked at Evelyn with an expression she didn't entirely have a word for. Something between assessment and something softer than assessment. "He doesn't pull punches," he said. "No," she agreed. "He doesn't. Reminds me of someone." She looked at him. He looked back, and for a moment, just a moment, in the ordinary afternoon light of her kitchen, there was something between them that was not the 16 years of the project and the petition and the controlled management of her life. Something more like what might have been between them if he'd made different decisions and she'd been permitted to grow up differently. She didn't know what to do with it exactly. She let it be there. He left an hour later. At the door he stopped and looked at her in the chair, in the doorway of her house, with Caleb visible in the kitchen behind her and the sound of Samuel's arithmetic workbook being dragged across the table. He looked at all of it. "I still think Montana is too far," he said. "I know you do." "I'll worry." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "But Father, it's my life to live, even if it worries you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way he nodded when he'd arrived at something he didn't love but accepted. He went down the porch steps and to his wagon without looking back, and the wagon went down the road toward town, and Evelyn watched it until it went around the bend and was out of sight. She stayed in the doorway for a moment after that, in the good spring air. The ranch was around her, the barn, the pasture, the cattle visible as dark shapes in the middle distance, the oak tree with its crown of new leaves moving in a light wind. The house was behind her, solid and present, with her husband in the kitchen and her stepchildren somewhere in it, and the accounts on the table that needed updating and bread that needed making tomorrow, and letters she was waiting on from Helena, and the whole apparatus of a life that was genuinely hers. She was not prone to sentiment, but she allowed herself, in that doorway, a moment of simply recognizing what it was. Then she went back inside. The town meeting happened the following week. It had not been her idea, and not Caleb's. It had been Doc Marsh's, who had been thinking about it since before Arthur Dorset arrived, and who had said privately to Caleb, that the situation had raised questions in Silvergate that were going to settle one way or another whether anyone managed them or not, and that it was better to give them a formal place to settle than to let them continue settling in storefronts and across fences. It was held on a Wednesday evening at the Silvergate Community Hall, which was a building that served as school meeting room and voting place, an occasional dance floor, and that smelled permanently of old wood and chalk dust. About 40 people came, which was most of the adults in the immediate area. The Pruitt sisters came. Georgia Greer came. Doc Marsh was there. The Calloway brothers were in the back. The new school teacher, Mr. Forrest, was near the front. Evelyn came in with Caleb beside her and Samuel on one side of her and Sarah on the other. And the room had that particular quality of a space where everyone present is performing nonchalance while being extremely aware of everything happening. Doc Marsh opened it. He was good at this. Meetings, management of public opinion, the navigation of what a community needed versus what it thought it needed. He framed it simply. A newcomer had joined the community, questions had been raised. It seemed useful to address those questions directly, rather than let them accumulate. Questions were raised. Some of them were practical, about the household, the children's schooling, what Evelyn's role on the ranch actually looked like in concrete terms. Some of them were less politely framed, which was what happened when you gave 40 people from a small town an open floor. A man named Garrett, who ran one of the farms on the north side of the valley, said, plainly, that he wasn't sure what exactly a woman in her situation could contribute to a working cattle operation, and he was curious how that was being managed. One of the Pruitt sisters said she'd heard the children weren't getting proper instruction, and was that the case? Caleb answered the first one. He stood up, and he turned to look at Garrett, and he said, "My accounts have been clean and current since November. My children know more than they did 6 months ago. My household runs better than it did when I was managing it alone, and I'll tell you plainly I wasn't managing it well." He said it without defensiveness, just the flat, direct accounting of observable facts. If you want to argue with that, you're arguing with things I've watched happen in my own house, and I don't know what would settle that argument for you. Garrett didn't have much to say to that. Samuel answered the second one. He stood up from his chair. He was 8, he was small, he had the expression of someone who has been patient with a situation longer than they intended to be. And he said clearly enough to be heard across the room, "I can do arithmetic 2 years ahead of what Mr. Forrest teaches. That's because of Evelyn. If that's not proper instruction, I don't know what is." He sat back down. Mr. Forrest, to his credit, confirmed this without being asked. Sarah said nothing during the meeting because Sarah had been given a very direct instruction before they came in and had, for once, honored it. But she sat beside Evelyn's chair with her hand resting on the armrest, in the particular way of a child who is making a spatial statement rather than a conversational one. Evelyn spoke twice. The first time when the meeting had been going for about 20 minutes and had hit a point where it was starting to go in circles, she said, "I want to ask the room something. What would convince you? Not what have you already decided. What would actually convince you?" She looked around. Because if the answer is nothing, that's useful information. It means this isn't a conversation about evidence. It's a conversation about something else, and we should probably name that directly. The room was quiet. The second time was near the end. A woman she didn't know well, a farmer's wife named Ruth Hendricks, who had said very little during the meeting, but whose expression had been one of genuine thought rather than confirmed opinion, said, "I want to ask you something, Mrs. Boon, and I want you to answer it honest. Do you think you're equal to the life out here? I'm not asking if you're capable. I've heard enough about that. I'm asking if you believe it yourself." Evelyn looked at her. "I think I'm equal to my life," she said, "the same way you are. Not to every life. I can't ride a horse, and I can't climb a ladder, and there are things that are harder for me than for you. But the life I actually have, the household, the children, the accounts, the work, yes, I'm equal to it. I know I am because I've been doing it for 6 months, and it's getting better, not worse." She paused. "I came here knowing it would be hard. I didn't come expecting it to be something it wasn't. I just wanted to find out what I was actually capable of, instead of what someone else had decided I was capable of." She held Ruth Hendricks' gaze. "That's not an unreasonable thing to want." Ruth Hendricks nodded. One slow nod, like something settling. The meeting ended without a vote, which Doc Marsh had apparently planned from the beginning. A vote would have made it a judgment, and he hadn't wanted that. He closed it by saying, practically, that the Boon household was a Boon household matter, and that Silvergate had always minded its own business, except when it didn't, and the room appreciated the slight joke and dispersed with the energy of people who have done something that was harder than they expected. Georgia Greer found Evelyn near the door on the way out and said, without preamble, "You should come to the Wednesday morning gathering at my store. Women in the area, we meet when we can. Nothing formal, coffee mostly." She looked at Evelyn with the directness that Evelyn had come to appreciate about her. "It'd be good to have you." Evelyn looked at her. "Thank you. Yes, I'd like that." The night after the meeting, after the children were long in bed and the house was settled into its nighttime sounds, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and let herself feel, without managing it, the full weight of the day and the week and the months before it. The petition, her father's face at the door of her house, the community hall, and 40 pairs of eyes, and Ruth Hendricks's honest question. It was a lot to carry. She was not going to pretend it wasn't. Caleb came back downstairs. He'd gone up and then apparently come back down, which he did sometimes, she'd noticed, when he couldn't sleep. He looked at her at the table and then went and got himself a glass of water and sat down across from her without asking if she wanted company, because by then he'd learned the difference between when she did and didn't. "You all right?" he said. "I will be," she said. It was honest. She wasn't entirely at that moment, but she would be. He nodded. He drank his water. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, which was be immense and indifferent, and inside the kitchen the lamp was low and the table was between them, and they sat in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to debrief it immediately. After a while, Caleb said, Samuel stood up. "I know." She almost smiled. "He was magnificent. He's 8. I know that too." Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "I keep thinking about what you said in there, about wanting to find out what you were actually capable of." He looked up. "You knew," he said, "before you came here. You already knew." She considered this. "I knew in theory," she said. "It's different to know in practice. In practice is the only place it counts." He held her gaze. "It counts here," he said. It was a simple thing to say. He said it simply, the way he said things that he meant entirely, without ornament, without building it up into anything it didn't need to be. She held it for a moment, the simplicity of it. "Yes," she said, "it does." They sat at the table a while longer and the lamp burned low, and eventually they went upstairs and the ranch was quiet around them under the late spring stars, and in the morning there would be the ordinary work of the day, the accounts, the bread, the children's lessons, the fence line in the south pasture. And all of it was hers, genuinely hers, earned and kept, and nobody was going to take it from her, and she knew that now in the only way that mattered, which was completely. Summer came to the Boone Ranch the way Montana summers always did, fast and certain, like something that had been waiting just past the tree line and finally decided it was time. The grass went tall in the east pasture. The creek ran full and cold from the snowmelt in the high country. The days stretched long at both ends, and the work stretched with them, and the house was warm in the evenings in a way that had nothing to do with the season. Evelyn noticed the change in herself before she could put a name to it. It came gradually, the way most real changes do. Not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of ordinary days that had added up to something she hadn't planned for. She woke up in the mornings without the particular weight she'd carried for most of her adult life. The low-grade vigilance of a person who has learned to expect resistance in most rooms she enters. It was still there sometimes. She didn't pretend otherwise. But it was no longer the first thing she felt when she opened her eyes, and that was different enough from what had been true before that she noticed its absence the way you notice a sound that has finally stopped. The Wednesday morning gatherings at Georgia Greer's store became a fixed point in her week. There were 6 women who came with regularity. Georgia herself, Ruth Hendricks from the farm on the East Road, a woman named Della Price, whose husband ran the livery, Two sisters named Hatch, who had come from Ohio 4 years ago with their respective husbands, and had the frank, unsentimental quality of women who have made hard adjustments and survived them, and occasionally Doc Marsh's wife Eleanor, who was quieter than her husband but considerably sharper. They drank coffee and talked about practical things, crops and livestock, and the state of the school and the reliability of the postal service, and occasionally less practical things, which were usually the more interesting conversations. Evelyn fit into this group with a naturalness that surprised her, given that she had spent most of her adult life in a household where her father managed who she spoke to and in what context. These women didn't manage her. They talked to her directly and expected directness back, and when she disagreed with something that was said, which happened with some regularity because she had opinions and had stopped apologizing for them, they disagreed back without taking it personally. She told Caleb about this one evening, not the specific content, just the quality of it, the thing it felt like. He was at the table cleaning one of the bridles, the methodical work of his hands doing what it usually did, which was give him something to do while he listened. He looked up when she stopped talking and said, "You sound surprised." "I am, a little." "Why?" She thought about it. "I expected acceptance to feel like something was being given to me," she said. "It feels more like something I built." He went back to the bridle. "That's because it is," he said. It was not a profound observation, and he didn't deliver it as one. He just said it the way you say something true. The letter from Graves and Helena came in June. The guardianship petition had been formally withdrawn and the record expunged, which Graves wrote was a clean outcome and one he did not always achieve. He sent his bill, which Caleb paid without complaint, and they filed the correspondence in the drawer where useful things lived. That was the end of Arthur Dorset's legal intervention, and it stayed ended. Her father wrote, however. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after he returned to Philadelphia, short, careful, reporting that his journey had been uneventful and that he hoped hers was well. She wrote back, not warmly, not coldly, just with the particular calibrated honesty she'd arrived at after a long time of figuring out what honesty looked like when aimed at a person you loved partially and had been damaged by partially and were not willing to write off entirely. He wrote again in August. She wrote back again. By October, they had established a correspondence that was not affectionate in any easy sense, but that was genuine. Two people feeling their way towards something that was at least truthful, which was more than they'd had for most of her life. She didn't expect it to become simple. It hadn't been simple and it wasn't going to be simple, and accepting that was its own kind of work. But she had found, in the months since he'd stood at her door and looked at the ranch she'd built her life in, that her anger at him had changed shape. It wasn't gone. It had just become less consuming, the way a fire becomes a coal. Still there, still real, but no longer the thing you have to organize your whole attention around. The buggy was Caleb's idea, and it came from a conversation she hadn't known he was still thinking about. It had started in February, during that closed-in stretch of winter when she'd told him, carefully and without self-pity, about the days when the world felt small. She'd thought he'd heard it and moved on, the way people move on from information that doesn't have an immediate application. But Caleb Boon filed things. It was one of his qualities. He didn't always respond to something right away, but he was paying attention, and information she'd given him in February he might be acting on in July. And the gap wasn't neglect, it was just how he processed. He told her about it on a Saturday morning, after the children had gone out to do the morning chores. He said he'd been talking to a man in Silvergate who built wagon components, and there was a design. He'd been working on it himself, sketching it out over the last few months, for a light two-wheel rig, something she could manage independently, sized for the ranch paths and the road to town. He put the sketches on the table. They were rough, clearly his own work rather than anything professional, with measurements marked in his compressed handwriting and several lines crossed out and redrawn. She looked at the sketches. She looked at them for a long time. "The turning radius is narrow enough for the yard," he said. He was pointing at a dimension mark. "The seat's set lower than a regular buggy, so you can transfer into it from the chair without needing help. The horse we'd use for it is Mabel. She's slow and she doesn't startle." He paused. "The man I talked to says 6 weeks to build if we order the parts next week." She was still looking at the sketches. She was aware, somewhere underneath the practical evaluation she was automatically running on the design, that her eyes were hot in a way she was not going to let go any further in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. "You drew these yourself," she said. "I'm not an engineer. There are things that'll need adjusting." "Caleb." He looked at her. "When did you start drawing these?" He thought about it. "March, probably. Around when you mentioned," he gestured slightly, meaning February, meaning the conversation about the world feeling small. "I kept thinking about the distances on the ranch, how you hadn't been out to the east pasture, or to the creek." She looked at the sketches again. She thought about the east pasture, which she had only seen from the upstairs window. She thought about the creek, which she'd heard every day and seen only twice, both times because someone had been with her to manage the rough ground. "Order the parts," she said. It took 8 weeks, not 6, because the component supplier in Billings was behind. But it arrived, and the builder, a quiet, methodical man named Asa, delivered it on a Thursday afternoon and went over it with Caleb while Evelyn watched from the porch and Sarah stood beside her at the railing, practically levitating with suppressed excitement. Samuel was there too, leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, which was his version of the same excitement. Caleb brought it around to the porch, and she transferred into it and picked up the reins, and Mabel looked back at her with the incurious expression of a horse who has been asked to do stranger things. She drove it to the end of the yard and turned it and came back. "Well?" Caleb said. "The turning radius on the left is a little wide," she said. "Not much. I can work with it." Asa said he could adjust the left trace. "Yes, do that." She looked at him. "It's good," she said. And then, because she was not given to more sentiment than a thing required, and because what she actually felt was larger than she intended to express in front of a builder she'd met 3 hours ago, she left it there. "It's good." He understood what she meant. That afternoon, she drove out to the east pasture for the first time. She went alone, which Caleb let her do after approximately 30 seconds of visible internal debate. The track from the ranch yard to the east pasture was rough in 2 places, but manageable, and Mabel walked it steadily in the way of a horse that has no strong feelings about most things, and Evelyn came out of the tree line where the track opened up and the east pasture spread in front of her. Long, flat grass going gold in the late summer light, the mountains blue in the far distance, a hawk working the air above the creek line, just as Samuel had described it. She stopped the buggy and sat there for a while. There was no dramatic thought in her head. It wasn't the kind of moment that announced itself as significant, which was why she trusted it. It was just the east pasture and the light on the grass and the hawk circling and the particular stillness that happens when you are alone somewhere large and your whole body understands that nobody needs anything from you right now. She sat in it for a while and let it be what it was. When she drove back, Samuel was sitting on the porch fence with his feet hooked on the lower rail, watching for her. He straightened when she came around the track into the yard, and she saw him try to make his expression back into neutrality and not quite manage it. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. "You were right about the hawk." His mouth moved. "It's always there in the late afternoon," he said. "I think it roosts in the cottonwoods by the creek. Come show me sometime." He looked at the buggy. "I could run alongside," he said, "if Mabel doesn't go too fast." "Mabel has never gone too fast in her life," she said. He almost smiled. He had the Boon version of smiling, which was a slight movement at the corner of the mouth and a shift in the eyes, and she'd come to recognize it and to understand that from Samuel, it was the equivalent of a full grin from someone else. The years that followed were not a resolution so much as a continuation. That was the honest way to put it. Life on the Boon Ranch did not achieve a state of completion. It just kept going, with all the ongoing difficulty and ordinary satisfaction that implied. The winter of the following year was bad, one of the worst the territory had seen in a decade, and they lost 3 cattle and had a month of being snowed in where cabin fever became a genuine operational concern, and everyone said things they had to partially apologize for afterward. The spring after that was better than anyone deserved after the winter they'd had. There were good years and hard years and years that were both simultaneously in different seasons. And through all of it, the ranch changed incrementally the way living things do. Not through dramatic overhaul, but through the steady accumulation of small improvements and adaptations, each one extending what had come before. Evelyn's correspondence course arrangement for Samuel became formalized by the time he was 10. She had found, through persistent correspondence with educational institutions in Chicago and St. Louis, a mathematics program that could be run by mail with quarterly evaluations by an examiner who traveled the territory. Samuel worked through it with the focused intensity of someone doing something that feels like what they're actually supposed to be doing, which is different from ordinary diligence and produces different results. By the time he was 12, he had surpassed what the program offered, and they were in new territory, which he found exhilarating and which Evelyn found deeply satisfying in the particular way of someone who has correctly identified something and had it prove her right. Sarah, who had never been going to be a mathematician, became something that nobody had specifically planned for her to become, which was a naturalist. The bird notebook, the one Evelyn had given her that first winter, had been followed by a second and then a third, and the cataloging had expanded from birds to plants to the insects she found in the creek margins and the small mammals she tracked through the east pasture. Doc Marsh gave her a proper reference book when she was 9 that she read until the spine broke. Mr. Forrest's replacement at the school, a woman named Agnes Carroll, who had come from Minnesota with actual scientific training and opinions about it, recognized what Sarah was and taught her accordingly. By the time she was 14, Sarah Boon could identify most of the native species in a 10-mile radius of the ranch and had strong views about creek ecology that she was not shy about expressing. The town of Silvergate changed too, in the incremental way of frontier towns that are deciding what they are going to be. The school got a second room. The road was improved. The hotel became a real hotel with 8 rooms instead of 4. Georgia Greer's store expanded into the building next door. The Wednesday morning gatherings, which had started with 6 women, had 12 by the time 3 years had passed, and had become something that had no official name but that functioned as the de facto civic intelligence of the community, the place where things were actually decided, in the informal way that real decisions are often made, before anyone held a formal meeting about them. Evelyn's place in Silvergate solidified not through any single event, but through time and presence and the long work of being known. She was not universally loved. She had too many opinions for that, and she had never learned the art of softening them past a certain point. The Pruitt sisters never fully warmed to her. There were people who would always look at her chair before they looked at her face, and she had arrived at a form of peace with that which was not acceptance exactly, more like a decision not to let it consume energy she had better uses for. But she was known. She was there. When the school board needed someone to run the accounts and nobody volunteered, Evelyn took it. When a family outside town had a difficult autumn and needed organizing, Evelyn organized it. When Ruth Hendrick's husband broke his leg in August during haying season and they were looking at losing the harvest, Evelyn and Caleb and 3 other families showed up, and the harvest got done. These were not extraordinary things. They were the ordinary things that communities are built from, repeated enough times that they become structural, and she was part of the structure. She thought sometimes about the woman who had gotten off the train in Silvergate, 7 months pregnant, with the idea that she could build a life somewhere nobody knew her or had already decided what she was. That woman had been right, and she'd also been naive about some of it, and she'd been braver than she'd felt and more frightened than she'd showed, which is probably the right combination. She didn't know, standing on that platform with the town watching, whether it would work. She had just known that she needed to find out, and that finding out required being somewhere she could actually try. Here's what she believed, having tried: that most of what people decide about other people is made very fast and on very little evidence, and that it sticks with a stubbornness entirely disproportionate to the quality of its foundations. She had spent her adult life watching people decide what she was capable of before they had any real information, and she understood by now that this was not cruelty, mostly. It was just how minds work when they're moving quickly through a world that offers more information than anyone can process. You make categories. You file people in them. You move on. The problem is the category, once made, becomes the lens. You don't see the person anymore. You see the category with a person-shaped outline. And the person inside the outline can spend enormous amounts of energy trying to demonstrate that the category is wrong, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it is exhausting in a way that the people holding the categories rarely understand because they're not the ones paying the cost. What she had found here, not all at once, not completely, but genuinely, was a place where she had been allowed to replace the category with herself. Not because people were exceptional, not because Silvergate was a community of unusual wisdom. Most of it was ordinary people doing ordinary things. But there had been enough of them willing to look past their first impression long enough to see something accurate, and that had been sufficient. And it had turned out that sufficient was enough. She had not needed the world to be different. She had needed a piece of it large enough to live in, and she had found it, and she had built on it, and it had become real. On an evening in late September, 4 years after the train from Philadelphia had brought her to a platform full of staring strangers, she drove the buggy out to the east pasture in the low golden light of early autumn and sat there for a while with the grass and the sky. The hawk was still there, or a hawk was, possibly the same one, possibly a successor. It was impossible to know. It moved in the same long arcs above the creek line, and she watched it and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of richness. She heard hoofbeats after a while, and then Caleb came around the tree line on his horse, and he pulled up beside the buggy and looked at her. "Dinner's going to be late," she said. "That's all right." He sat easy in the saddle the way he sat everything, without excess, his hands loose on the reins. He looked out at the pasture. The light was going orange on the mountains. "Samuel found the hawk's nest," he said. "He's been down at the creek for an hour. He'll come back when it's dark." "I know." They sat there for a while in the easy quiet that years of living with someone will produce. Not the quiet of two people who have nothing to say, but the quiet of two people who have said enough that silence doesn't feel like absence. The ranch was below them, and the valley was wide, and the mountains were doing what they always did, which was sit there in their enormous indifference and make everything else feel the right size. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked at her. "Are you glad?" It was not an eloquent question. She meant it plainly. Are you glad it went this way, that the woman on the platform was this one and not another, that the house became what it became? He was quiet for a moment. The honest pause, not the evasive one. She knew the difference by now. "Yes," he said. Simple, full weight behind it, same as always. She looked at the mountains. "Good," she said. They rode back to the ranch as the last light left the sky, and the house came into view with its lit windows and the oak tree at the corner gone to autumn red, and somewhere inside Sarah's voice was audible in that particular indeterminate register that meant she was either telling someone a story or arguing a point, and the odds were roughly even. Samuel appeared from the direction of the creek as they came into the yard, covered in mud to the knee from the marsh grass, carrying his notebook and looking satisfied. "The nest is in the second cottonwood," he said. "I was right." "You usually are," Evelyn said. He looked at her with that almost smile. "You usually are too," he said, which from Samuel was both a compliment and an accurate observation, and probably the highest form of praise he had available. She went inside. The kitchen was warm and the table needed setting, and there was bread from this morning that was still good and a pot that had been simmering since afternoon. Sarah came in from wherever she'd been and started talking before she was fully through the door, something about a beetle she'd found near the barn with markings she hadn't cataloged yet. Caleb came in and hung his hat and washed his hands and stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, the way he sometimes did, just taking it in. Evelyn set the table. She did it the way she did most things, efficiently, without ceremony, her hands moving through the familiar work. But she was aware, in the way you are aware of things when you allow yourself to be, of the full texture of the moment, the warm kitchen, the voice of the child talking about her beetle, the man in the doorway, the table under her hands, the window showing the last of the evening sky over the mountains. She had arrived here in a wheelchair, in a town that had frozen at the sight of her, and she had made this. Not perfectly. There had been arguments and difficult months and things that still required tending, and there would be more of all of those things. But she had made it, and it was real, and it was hers. That was the thing she would have wanted to tell the woman on the platform, if such a thing were possible. Not that it would be easy, not that people would come around, or that the world would accommodate her, or that love would solve the problems that love cannot solve. Just that the life on the other side of the risk was worth the cost of taking it. That the ground she'd been afraid didn't exist could be built, in fact, if you were willing to do the building. She had been willing. That had been the only requirement. Not perfection, not certainty, not permission from the people who had decided what she was before she arrived. Just the willingness to go somewhere and try. It had been enough.